She didn't mean to grab him. She didn't even know his name. But when a billionaire in a soaked silk dress pulled a grease-stained stranger close and whispered, "Please just kiss me." 5 minutes. Please, neither of them understood what those 5 minutes would cost them. She thought she was buying herself an escape. He thought he was helping a stranger in trouble. They were both wrong, because the woman who stumbled into that garage wasn't just any billionaire. And the man she grabbed wasn't just any mechanic. 5 years earlier, her company destroyed his life. And now fate, or something crueler than fate, had just put them in the same room. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end, because this one goes places you will not see coming. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from tonight? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go. The storm came in fast. That was the thing about the coastal edge of Millhaven. Weather didn't announce itself the way it did inland. One moment, the sky above the harbor was a flat gray pressing low over the rooftops, and the next, the rain was horizontal, coming in sheets hard enough to sting exposed skin and turn the gutters into small rivers running brown with grit. By 8:30 on a Thursday evening, the streets of the warehouse district had gone mostly empty. The kind of empty that makes footsteps echo and makes a woman in heels feel very alone very quickly. Helena Carrington ran. She wasn't a woman who ran. Not in any sense of the word. She was 50 years old, the sole owner and chief executive of Carrington Motors, a company with 11,000 employees and a valuation that had at various moments over the past decade made her the subject of magazine covers. Hostile acquisition attempts, congressional testimony, and exactly the kind of article that begins with the most powerful woman in the American automotive industry. She had weathered all of that without visible damage. She walked into rooms and rooms changed their temperature. She had fired men twice her size and said good afternoon after. She did not run. But Victor Langston's voice was still loud in her head, louder than the rain, and his hand had closed around her wrist in a way that left a mark she could already feel forming, and so she ran. She'd made a mistake agreeing to dinner. She knew that now, about 40 minutes too late, the way you often know things after the door is already closing behind you. Victor was old money and newer volatility, a man who'd built his investment portfolio on instinct and built his personality on this assumption that no one would push back. He'd been drinking since 7, and sometime around the appetizers, he'd stopped performing charm and started performing ownership. The comments had sharpened. The hand on her knee had stayed too long. And when she'd excused herself after the entrees and slipped out the restaurant's side exit, he'd followed her into the rain. Helena. His voice had been too patient for the situation. That particular patient's deliberate warning was worse than shouting. "We're not done." She'd kept walking. He'd kept following. She'd turned 3 corners trying to lose him in the maze of the warehouse district, and that was when she saw the light. It was a pale yellow rectangle at street level, a garage bay door, half open, the kind of half open, that said someone was still inside working rather than that the door was broken. A hand-painted sign above it, letters faded but legible, Beaumont Auto. Below that, smaller honest work, fair price. Below that, even smaller, almost apologetic, no appointments necessary. She ducked inside before she made a decision about it. The garage smelled like motor oil, old rubber, and somewhere underneath both, something warm coffee, maybe, or the lingering heat of welding work done hours before. A single shop light hung over a lifted truck on the center hoist, and beneath it, a man was lying on a mechanic's creeper, only his legs visible from the waist down, working at something underneath with the focused, unhurried rhythm of someone who'd done this particular task 100 times. She stood at the entrance, rain still running off her hair and her ruined dress, and tried to catch her breath. He slid out from under the truck without hurrying. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-30s maybe, with the kind of build that comes from actual physical work rather than a gym broad in the shoulders, hands that were permanently stained at the knuckles no matter how much he cleaned them. His face was angular and tired in the way men get tired when they're managing more than one life at once. Dark circles that weren't new, a jawline that needed a shave 3 days ago. He was wearing a gray work shirt with the sleeves pushed to the elbows and his name stitched in faded thread over the breast pocket, Asher. He sat up on the creeper and looked at her the way people look at things that don't make sense in context, not rude, just accurately uncertain. "We're closed," he said. "I know. I'm sorry." She glanced back at the garage entrance. The rain outside was loud. I need a minute." He didn't move to throw her out, which she registered as a small mercy. He reached past her and pulled a shop rag from the workbench, wiping his hands with the resigned efficiency of someone who'd already accepted that the work under the truck was done for the night. "You okay?" he asked. The question was direct, not performative concern, not the practiced sympathy she got from employees and board members, but the genuine kind, the kind that meant he'd actually looked at her and noticed she wasn't. "I'll be fine," she said, which wasn't an answer. He glanced at her wrist. The mark Victor's grip had left was dark against her skin, not quite a bruise yet, but heading there. He looked back at her face, and something in his expression shifted, not dramatic, just a quiet recalibration of what he was dealing with. "You can stay," he said simply, and turned back toward his tools. She exhaled for the first time in several minutes. Then she heard the footsteps. Victor's shoes, expensive ones, leather soles were unmistakable on wet pavement. The particular click of them. She'd heard that sound in boardrooms and at charity dinners, and now here, outside a garage in the rain, and her whole body went tight. She didn't plan it. She did not think it through. There was no moment of rational consideration. There was only the sound of Victor's footsteps, the mouth of the garage behind her, and the mechanic standing 2 feet away. She grabbed Asher's arm. He turned, startled, a wrench still in one hand. "Please," she said. Her voice came out lower than she meant it to. "Please, I need you to kiss me. Just for a minute. 5 minutes. Please. There's a man outside, and I need him to think I'm here with someone. Please." He stared at her. Outside, the footsteps slowed. "I'll pay you," she said, which came out badly, and she knew it immediately. His expression didn't change exactly, but something moved behind his eyes, a flicker, of something that might have been amusement, and might have been offense, and was probably both. He set the wrench down on the workbench, very deliberately, and looked at her for a long moment. "I don't want your money," he said. "Then please," she said. Just that, no leverage, no logic, no strategic framing. Just the word, and whatever he could see on her face. The footsteps stopped outside the garage entrance. Asher made a decision. He stepped forward, took her face in both hands, careful, deliberate, the way a man handles something he's trying not to damage, and kissed her. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't long. It was just real enough to be convincing from 4 feet away, and Victor Langston stood at the edge of the garage bay for 3 full seconds. She counted them before making a sound low in his throat that had no word attached to it. "Helena." His voice was very controlled. "I see." She didn't turn around. She kept her eyes closed, and one hand pressed against Asher's chest, feeling his heartbeat, which was steady in a way that seemed biologically unreasonable given the circumstances. A pause. Then Victor's footsteps retreated. She exhaled again. Asher stepped back, putting appropriate distance between them with the same economy with which he did everything else. He didn't look embarrassed exactly, but he didn't look comfortable either. He looked like a man reassessing his evening. "Gone?" he asked. She turned and checked. The garage entrance was empty. "Yes," he nodded once, picked up the wrench again. She stood there for another moment, still processing. "I'm Helena," she said, because it seemed like the least she could do. "Asher," he said, without looking up. "I know, your shirt." He glanced down at the stitching on his breast pocket, apparently having forgotten it was there, and something pulled briefly at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but in the general neighborhood. "Right," he said. She found her purse where it had fallen near the entrance and retrieved a business card from the interior pocket. By some small miracle, it was only slightly damp. She set it on his workbench. "Thank you," she said. "Genuinely, I'm sorry for all of that." "It's fine," he said. "It isn't, but thank you for saying so." She pulled her jacket tighter, a useless gesture. The jacket was soaked through and moved toward the entrance. The rain had softened slightly. Victor's footsteps were gone. She stepped back into the wet street without looking back. Asher stood in his garage for a while after the sound of her heels faded into the rain. He looked at the business card on his workbench. He didn't pick it up. He turned back to the truck on the hoist and lay back down on the creeper and slid under it, staring at the undercarriage with the concentrated quiet of a man trying not to think about something specific. Above him, at the back of the garage, a door opened. Small footsteps crossed the concrete floor, And then a 9-year-old boy appeared at the edge of the work light, wearing pajamas printed with spacecraft and holding a half-eaten peanut butter sandwich. "Dad," said Caleb, "there's rain coming in under the back door again." "I know," Asher said. "I'll fix it this weekend. You said that last weekend." "This time I mean it." Caleb looked around the garage with the specific interest children have in spaces where adults do serious things. His gaze landed on the business card. "Who's that from?" "Nobody," Asher said. "Go back to bed. It's only 9:30. 9:30 is late. For who? For 9-year-olds. Caleb considered this with the philosophical patience of a child who understood he was losing the argument but wasn't ready to concede. He took another bite of his sandwich. "Did something happen? You look weird." "I look exactly the same as always. You look like when something happened but you don't want to talk about it." Asher slid back out from under the truck and sat up on the creeper and looked at his son in the pale work light. Caleb had his mother's eyes, that particular shade of gray-green that caught light and did something complicated with it. It was the thing about his kid's face that Asher still wasn't quite used to, even now, 3 years later. Probably never would be. "A woman came in during the rain," Asher said. "She was in some trouble. I helped her out. That's it." Caleb looked at the business card again. "What kind of trouble?" "The adult kind. Finish your sandwich and go to sleep." "What does adult trouble mean?" "It means none of your business." "Go." Caleb retreated toward the back door, not quite convinced. Asher listened to his footsteps cross the floor and the interior door open and close. He looked at the business card again. This time he picked it up. The card was clean and heavy, the kind of card that cost more per hundred than most people spent on groceries. No logo. Just a name in restrained black type, Helena Carrington. Below it, Chief Executive Officer, Carrington Motors. Below that, a direct line. Asher held the card for a long time. Then he set it down and went back under the truck. And he didn't think about it. He was good at not thinking about things. 5 years of practice had made him very, very good at it. He thought about the undercarriage. He thought about the torque specs. He thought about the rain coming in under the back door that he'd been meaning to fix for 2 weekends. He did not think about Helena Carrington. He did not think about Carrington Motors. He finished the job, killed the shop light, and went inside. Caleb was asleep when Asher checked. He stood in the doorway of his son's room for a moment, the way parents stand in doorways, that specific stillness, something between gratitude and grief, the weight of everything you're responsible for pressing gently against your chest. The room smelled like kid smell, that particular combination of shampoo and dirty sneakers, and the dry papery scent of books. Caleb had fallen asleep with a library book open across his chest, some illustrated thing about structural engineering that Asher had checked out for him 3 weeks ago and kept meaning to return. Asher took the book, set it on the nightstand, pulled the blanket up. He went to his own room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall. The framed photograph on the dresser was the one from the coast, him and Mara. Early days, both of them squinting into the sun and laughing at something neither of them could have remembered 5 minutes later. She was 32 in that photograph. She never got to 34. He didn't take the photograph down. He'd thought about it in the hard middle months when looking at it felt like putting his hand on a hot surface. But Caleb liked the photograph. Caleb said it helped him remember her voice, which made no sense logically but made complete sense in the way children make sense of things. Asher lay back and stared at the ceiling. He thought about the woman in the garage, the silk dress destroyed by rain, the mark on her wrist, the way she'd said please, not with expectation, not with the authority of someone accustomed to people doing what she asked, but with actual need, stripped down to its simplest form. He thought about how she'd felt, briefly, against him. Steady, warmer than the cold outside, had any right to leave her. He thought about the card on the workbench. Carrington Motors. The name moved through him like something cold. He turned onto his side and closed his eyes and lay there for a long time, listening to the rain ease off into silence. And he felt 5 years of carefully managed distance start to press at its seams, and he thought, she won't come back. People like that never come back. He believed this with complete certainty, the certainty of a man who has learned, the hard way, not to expect anything from the world that the world hasn't already demonstrated it intends to give. He was wrong. She came back the next morning. Asher was underneath the same truck. He'd found a secondary issue with the brake line that he hadn't caught the night before, which irritated him. Because he didn't miss things when he heard the car pull up outside. Not any car. The specific, almost inaudible purr of something German and expensive idling at the curb. He heard the door close, not slammed, just closed, deliberate, and then heels on the concrete apron outside the garage bay. He slid out from under the truck. She was standing at the entrance in different clothes than the night before: dark slacks, a cream-colored blouse that probably cost more than his monthly utilities, her dark hair pulled back cleanly. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman accustomed to controlling the temperature of any room she entered. But she was holding a paper coffee cup in each hand, with the slightly uncertain body language of someone who'd rehearsed an entrance and was now second-guessing it. "I brought coffee," she said. "I didn't know how you take it, so I brought one black and one with cream and sugar, and I figured you could pick." Asher looked at the two cups. He looked at her. He wiped his hands on the shop rag. "Black," he said. She crossed the garage and handed it over. He took it. She kept the other one and stood there, and there was a beat of silence that neither of them filled right away. "I wanted to apologize properly," she said. "Last night I put you in an unfair position." "I didn't ask. I just acted." "You did," he said. "I'm sorry." He drank the coffee. It was good coffee, not the gas station kind, and for a fraction of a second, that small detail annoyed him in a way he couldn't entirely explain. "You don't need to apologize. You were in trouble. That doesn't make it okay to grab a stranger." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She accepted that without flinching, which he noted. He was accustomed to people with money and position deflecting, softening, steering the conversation back toward their own comfort. She just took it. "Did he bother you again?" Asher asked. "After. No." Something flickered in her expression. Victor he has his own calculations. Once he understood the situation, he moved on. She said it carefully. "The way you talk about weather patterns, something you can't control, but have learned to predict." "He hurt you," Asher said flatly, meaning the wrist. She glanced down at it. The mark had darkened overnight into something that sat unmistakably between a grip and a bruise. "It's not the first time he's grabbed me," she said, and then stopped, as if she hadn't planned on saying that. The admission sat in the air between them. "Okay," Asher said, because he wasn't sure what else to say to that, and he didn't want to perform sympathy at her. She struck him as someone who'd had enough of performed sympathy. She seemed to appreciate it. She looked around the garage, really looked, the way people look at spaces when they're stalling for time. Her eyes moved over the tools arranged on the wall pegboard, the ancient cough maker on the shelf above the workbench, the child-sized jacket hanging from a hook near the back door. "You have a son," she said. "Yes, how old?" 9. She nodded, looking at the jacket. "He's in school now?" "Should be. He drank more coffee. Usually gets himself there. About half the time I walk him." "You do this alone," she said. It wasn't a question. There was no pity in it, which was the only version of that observation he could have tolerated. "Yes," he said. Another silence. From somewhere in the back of the building, the living quarters attached to the shop, narrow and perpetually in need of one repair or another, came the sound of small feet on floorboards. Asher turned. "Caleb, you're late." Caleb appeared in the interior doorway, still pulling a backpack over one shoulder, hair uncombed in the way of 9-year-olds who viewed combing hair as a philosophical position rather than a hygiene requirement. He took in the woman standing in his father's garage with the complete openness of children who haven't yet learned to be subtle about their curiosity. "Who are you?" he asked. Caleb Asher said, "What?" "I'm just asking." Helena smiled, a real one, slightly surprised by it. "Helena," she said. Caleb Asher started. "It's fine." Helena reached into her jacket pocket and produced another card. Presumably she carried them the way other people carry gum. She held it out to Caleb, who took it with both hands and read it with the focused intensity of a child, who reads everything placed in front of him. The garage went quiet. Caleb read the card again. He looked up at his father. Something in his face had changed, the easy curiosity replaced by a child's version of caution, the instinct that something in the room has shifted, and he isn't sure why. "Dad," he said carefully. "It says Carrington Motors." Asher was already looking at Helena. She saw it happen, the change in his face. Later she would think about that moment as a door closing. Not slowly, the way doors close in movies, but the way they close in real life fast, with finality, the air pressure changing on both sides. Get to school, Asher told Caleb. His voice was the same register, same volume. But something in it had gone absolutely flat. Caleb looked between them. He was 9, not stupid. Dad Caleb, now. The boy went, glancing back once before the bay entrance swallowed him. Asher set his coffee cup on the workbench. He didn't smash it, didn't raise his voice, didn't do any of the things anger usually looks like from the outside. He just put the cup down, with the precision of a man controlling something very carefully, and then he turned to Helena, and what was on his face was not what she'd expected. It wasn't rage, it was worse than rage. It was the expression of a man who had for approximately 30 seconds let himself exist in a world where last night was just a strange and almost funny story, a billionaire in a ruined dress asking a garage mechanic for a favor, and who had just been pulled back into a different and much more specific world. Carrington Motors, he said. Yes, Helena said. She stood her ground, though something in her posture had shifted a tightening, bracing. You're Helena Carrington. Yes. As in Marcus Carrington's daughter. As in you inherited the company. When my father died 4 years ago, yes. He nodded, very slowly. The way people nod when they're processing something they already know on some level, but needed to hear said plainly. Then I need you to leave, he said. She didn't move. Mr. Beaumont, I need you to take your coffee and your card and whatever you came here to do, and I need you to leave my garage. I came to apologize. You did. I heard it. His voice was controlled, absolutely controlled, and that controls was the most alarming thing in the room. Now I need you to go. She looked at him for a long moment. Long enough that he thought she was going to push, to demand an explanation, to do what people with her kind of authority almost always do when faced with resistance from someone with no leverage. But she didn't. She put her coffee cup down on the workbench next to his. She picked up her jacket from where she'd draped it over the stool. She turned toward the entrance. She stopped. Why? She asked, without turning around. Because I said so. That's not a reason. She turned then, and her face was careful, but her eyes were direct. I've spent enough of my life accepting, because I said so, from people who thought their position entitled them to it. I'd like a reason. The silence in the garage was the particular kind that makes sounds from outside a passing car, a bird somewhere feel very far away. Asher looked at the floor, then at his hands, then at her. 5 years ago, he said, I was a propulsion engineer. I worked for Carrington Motors for 4 years. I was good at my job. He said the last part, without arrogance, just as fact, the way a carpenter might say he was good at cutting a joint. I led the design team on a next-generation propulsion prototype. We called it the R7. I designed the safety system myself. Every protocol, every failsafe. I checked it 4 times. He stopped. Helena was very still. The board and the investors were pushing to accelerate testing. We weren't ready. I wrote 2 memos saying we weren't ready. Those memos were received and ignored. He stopped again, and when he continued, his voice had thinned slightly, the way voices do when they're moving over something sharp. During the accelerated test, the prototype failed catastrophically. 2 men died, both of them junior technicians. One of them had a daughter who was 4 months old. Helena's hand had risen slightly, unconsciously, toward her mouth. The investigation concluded that the safety mechanism I designed had failed due to engineer error. He met her eyes. My error. They had timestamps showing I'd altered the safety protocols the night before the test. They had testimony from 2 supervisors confirming I'd been warned about the risk and proceeded anyway. They had my access credentials on the system logs. He let that settle. None of it was true. But I couldn't prove that because the original files I needed were gone. The investigation was completed in 11 days. I was terminated. My engineering license was suspended pending a formal review that never meaningfully happened. Within 2 months, every company in the industry had seen the report. The bay light hummed overhead. I had a wife, he said. Mara. She was sick. Had been sick for about a year, kidney disease, manageable with treatment, but the treatment wasn't cheap, and the treatment depended on insurance, and the insurance depended on my employment. He paused. We managed for a while. She didn't complain. That was just how she was. The sentence came out slightly off its axis, like something he'd meant to say one way and it came out another. She died 14 months after I was fired. She was 32 years old. Helena said nothing. There was nothing to say that wasn't inadequate, and she seemed to understand that. I have a 9-year-old and a garage and a mortgage I'm 3 months behind on, Asher said. That is the story of my relationship with Carrington Motors. So when I tell you I need you to leave, that's why. He expected her to apologize. To offer something money, probably a settlement, the language of institutional liability. He was braced for it. Instead, she said, "Who ran the investigation?" He blinked. "The internal investigation," she said, and her voice had changed, not louder, but more precise, a particular quality of attention that was different from her general composure. "Who led it?" "A man named Radford, chief safety officer at the time." "And who appointed the external reviewers?" Asher looked at her carefully. "The board did, on recommendation from the investors. Victor Langston was the one who—" He stopped. Something crossed his face. Victor Langston pushed hardest for the accelerated testing timeline. Victor Langston recommended the investigators. I never put those two things in the same sentence before. "No," Helena said quietly. "Most people wouldn't." She picked up her jacket again, and this time her movements had the quality of someone who has just received information they needed and is now organizing what to do with it. "I inherited the company 4 years ago. I've been modernizing operations, changing board composition, cleaning up practices that my father wasn't a careful man, and some of the people around him were considerably worse. But I didn't know about this. The R7 incident was closed before I was involved, and the file was—" She paused. "I want to say the file was sealed for legal reasons. What I'm now wondering is whether it was sealed for other reasons." Asher watched her. "I'm not asking for your trust," she said. "I haven't earned it, and I know that. But I want to look at this. It's 5 years old. Things don't have an expiration date." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, a truck rumbled past on the street. The shop light flickered once and steadied. "You'll look at it," he said. "And then what?" The investigation concluded. "My license is the company's liability, is public—" "I'm the company," she said. "I decide what the company does." He looked at her. Really looked not the way he'd looked at her the night before, when she was a stranger in trouble, and not the way he'd looked at her 10 minutes ago, when she was a name on a card, but the way you look at someone when you're trying to determine whether they're telling the truth, and you know you might be the worst judge of this particular person, because you have every reason to want them to be lying. "Why?" he asked. "Because 2 men died," she said. "And a woman died, and a child lost his mother. And if any of that happened because of something that went wrong inside my company that I'm responsible for now, whether I caused it or not, then I need to know." He said nothing. She moved toward the entrance. This time she kept going, stepping out into the morning light, and he watched her walk to her car, the understated German thing he'd heard pull up, black, no driver and get in, and pull into the street with the particular precision of someone who learned to drive themselves rather than be driven. He stood in the middle of his garage for a long time after the car disappeared. Then he picked up his coffee cold now and drank the rest of it anyway, and went back to work. He didn't expect anything to come of it. He'd made peace with that, or something he called peace, which was really more like a managed ceasefire between himself and his expectations. He had Caleb, he had the garage, he had Tuesdays when the library was open late, and Caleb would sit in the children's section for 2 hours, reading anything with a diagram in it, and Asher would sit across the building pretending to read a magazine, while watching his son's face do the thing it did when he found something interesting, that specific forward tilt, eyes narrowed slightly, lips moving without sound. That was his life, and there were worse lives. But 3 days after Helena left the garage, his phone rang from an unfamiliar number. It was a woman named Priya Anand, who introduced herself as the head of internal audit for Carrington Motors. She had a voice that communicated extreme competence and very little patience for small talk. She told him that Ms. Carrington had requested a full review of the R7 incident file, and that she, Pra, had been assigned to conduct it, and that she had some preliminary questions if he was willing to speak. He was willing. He stood in the back of his garage with the phone against his ear, and answered every question she asked: dates, names, procedures, the sequence of events in the 48 hours before the test, and she listened without interrupting, which he appreciated, and asked follow-up questions that told him she'd already reviewed whatever documentation existed and knew which parts didn't add up. "The timestamps on the altered files," she said at one point. "You're saying you weren't in the building that evening?" "I was at a hospital. My wife had a procedure that afternoon routine, but she needed someone with her." I have the admissions records. I have parking garage receipts. A brief silence. Those records were never requested during the original investigation. No, he said, they weren't. Another silence longer. Mr. Beaumont, I want to be honest with you. I've been doing internal audit work for 11 years, and I've seen a lot of files that were closed quickly and cleanly. The R7 file is one of the cleanest closes I've ever seen. In my experience, files that close that cleanly are either genuinely straightforward or very carefully managed. This one, she paused. This one has some inconsistencies I'd like to examine further. He sat down on the stool by his workbench. Outside, he could hear a delivery truck making its rounds on the block. What kind of inconsistencies? He asked. Engineering records that reference attachments that aren't present in the file. Testimony transcripts that are dated but have no corresponding interview notes. And a chain of custody log that shows 2 files were accessed and modified the week before the investigation concluded using executive-level credentials. Asher said nothing. I'll be in touch, Priya said. Don't discuss this with anyone outside this conversation for now. I need you to trust me on that. I don't know you, he said. No, she said, but Miss Carrington does, and she trusted this to me. He accepted that, provisionally, because there wasn't much else to do. He hung up and sat in the quiet of his garage and felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years, try to surface something that lived adjacent to hope but was afraid of that word, the way you're afraid of things that have hurt you before. He pressed it back down and told himself, wait, see what happens. Don't build anything on this yet. He was still telling himself that when the photograph appeared online. He found out about it the way people found out about things they didn't want to know through someone else. Caleb's teacher called him, which was unprecedented, and the call was awkward enough that Asher could tell Mrs. Gallagher had been thinking about making it for at least an hour before she did. Apparently some of the other parents were talking. A photograph had circulated Asher and a woman, close together, in what appeared to be an embrace, and the woman had been identified, and some of the parents had recognized Asher's face, and Mrs. Gallagher wanted him to know before Caleb heard about it at school if he hadn't already. He pulled the image up on his phone after he hung up. Someone had taken it through the open bay door, not a great shot, slightly blurry with rain, but clear enough. Helena's hands at his chest, his hands at her face. It looked, from the outside, exactly like what it was supposed to look like. The caption on the most widely shared version read, Carrington Motors CEO Helena Carrington photographed at what sources describe as a discreet location with an unidentified man Thursday evening. By morning, the unidentified man had been identified. The story had evolved. The comments were what comments always were. He put his phone face down on the workbench and went back to work, and tried not to think about what this meant for Caleb, who would navigate whatever came with the particular brand of dignity 9-year-olds deploy when they haven't fully processed that something is humiliating yet. Helena called him that afternoon. You've seen it, she said, before he could speak. Yes, I'm sorry. I don't know who took it. I have people trying to find out. It's done, he said. Finding out doesn't undo it. No. A pause. The board has seen it. There are certain members who she stopped, editing whatever she'd been about to say. There's a proposal being circulated, a business proposal. To manage the narrative, he waited. The R7 prototype program was revived 18 months ago, she said carefully. We're at an early stage, but the intent is to complete the original design concept. Some board members are suggesting that bringing you in as a consultant making it public, framing it as a reconciliation of sorts, would reframe the photograph as a professional relationship and generate positive coverage at a time when the company could use some. Asher let the silence go long enough to mean something. They want to use me, he said. They want to use the situation. Yes, I want to be honest with you about what's on the table and what's driving it. And what do you want? Another pause. This one felt different, less calculated, more like she was finding something she hadn't known exactly where she'd put it. I want the investigation to run, she said. I want to know what happened to those 2 men. I want to know what happened to you. If putting you in a building with access to the original engineering files achieves that, then I also want you to come work on the prototype. But I am not willing to do it through dishonesty. If you come knowing exactly what it is. He looked at the wall of his garage, the tool pegboard, the stain on the floor from an oil leak he'd fixed 3 years ago and never quite gotten out. If I come, he said, I need unrestricted access. Every original file from the R7 program. Not the investigation file, the engineering records. The test data, the pre-test reports, everything. I'll authorize it. If those files have been further altered since Prius has started looking at them, I'll know. And if that happens, I walk. Understood. And I need it in writing, he said. Not a handshake. Not your word. An actual written agreement. My attorney reviews it. She didn't hesitate, of course. He almost said no anyway. He stood there with the phone against his ear and thought about Mara and about the two technicians whose names he still knew, Daniel Ozzie and Marcus Webb, and about the 4-month-old daughter that Daniel Ozzie had left behind, who would be in school now, who would have started school without a father. All right, he said. He heard her exhale just once, barely audible. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated than relief. One more thing, he said. Yes, my son doesn't get involved in any of this. The public side, the coverage, whatever the board is planning. He's 9 years old, and his life isn't a narrative management strategy. Agreed, she said immediately. Absolutely. He hung up and stood in the garage and looked at the afternoon light coming in through the bay door, cutting long and golden across the oil-stained floor. He'd told himself not to build anything on this yet. He was already building something. He could feel it, the careful, almost involuntary assembly of something he'd kept packed away, something that felt like the version of himself that existed before everything collapsed. He tried to keep his hands steady around it, the way you carry something fragile across an uneven floor. Not squeezing, not gripping, just holding on carefully and hoping you make it across. He started at Carrington Motors on a Monday. He drove himself in his truck, which was 11 years old, and had a rear bumper held in place by 2 bolts and optimism. He parked in the visitor lot, because no one had told him where else to park, and he walked through the main entrance in his cleanest work clothes, dark jeans, a decent shirt, boots he'd actually polished, carrying his father's old leather notebook, which was battered and coffee-stained, and which contained, among other things, the original calculations he'd made over 4 years of work on the R7 program. The lobby of Carrington Motors' main facility was the kind of space designed to make you feel the weight of the institution. Vaulted glass ceiling. The original prototype from 1987 mounted on a display platform like a museum piece, a reception desk that was approximately the size of Asher's entire apartment. He stood in the lobby and felt the familiar specific discomfort of returning to a place that had decided you didn't belong there anymore. Helena met him herself, rather than sending someone, which he hadn't expected. She appeared from a corridor off the main lobby, and she was in full professional mode, now structured jacket, the kind of composed authority that had clearly taken years to build. But she looked at him with something direct and unguarded that sat oddly against all the composure, like a window in a very formal wall. "Welcome back," she said, and then visibly reconsidered whether that was the right thing to say. "It's a building," he said. "I've been in buildings." Something that was almost a smile. "Fair enough. I'll take you to the engineering floor." They walked the corridor together, and he remembered the layout from 5 years ago, mostly. Some things had changed. New signage, a wall of framed patent certificates that hadn't been there. The carpet had been replaced. Other things hadn't changed at all. He stopped outside a glass-walled conference room. Inside, the current propulsion engineering team was visible at a long table, 5 people, late 20s to early 40s, the organized chaos of an early-phase design project spread across every surface. Someone had a 3D printed component in both hands and was making a point with it that required a lot of gesturing. "That's the R7 revival team," Helena said. She paused. "They're good engineers. I want to be clear about that." "But," Asher said, "but they've been working from a reconstruction of the original design because the original files are incomplete. As we've discussed." She said the last part carefully. He watched the team through the glass for a moment. The engineer with the component was still talking, and the 2 people across from him were listening, with the expressions of people who want to believe the problem is as simple as the speaker thinks it is, but suspect it isn't. "What's the current status of the prototype?" he asked. 71% complete. "We hit a structural issue with the thermal regulation coupling 3 months ago that slowed things considerably. The team has proposed 3 solutions, none of which fully satisfy the stress modeling." Asher looked at the printed component the engineer was holding. From this distance, he couldn't read the details, but the geometry of it was visible. And something in the geometry was, "Can I see the stress models?" he asked. "That's why you're here." He looked away from the glass. He looked at her. "Then let's start," he said. They gave him a desk in a corner office adjacent to the engineering floor, glassed in, separate, which was probably intentional, a concession to the awkwardness of the situation. He didn't mind the separation. He set his notebook on the desk and the first box of original R7 files beside it. Priya had pulled everything she could locate and had it waiting for him, and he sat down and he opened the first folder. He was 32 years old, and he was back inside the building that had ended his previous life, and his hands were completely steady. He found the flaw in the thermal regulation coupling within 4 hours. It was subtle, the kind of thing you'd miss if you were working from a reconstruction rather than the original, because the reconstruction had inherited an error from the incomplete source data. A misaligned load distribution assumption that the current team's models had been trying to compensate for without knowing that's what they were doing. He wrote it up cleanly, with the math, and left it on the senior engineer's desk before he left for the day. He didn't say anything about it. He just left it there. On his way out of the building, he stopped by the records room that Priya's team had set up for the investigation review. He stood in the doorway and looked at the boxes arranged on the table, the original R7 program files. 5 years of engineering work, his work, and he felt the old anger try to rise and breathe through it. Then he saw it. In the stack of files closest to the door, the ones Priya had labeled Pre-Test Safety Review, a folder was slightly misaligned from the others, as if it had been pulled recently and replaced in a hurry. He didn't touch it. He just looked at the label, Safety Protocol Sign-Off R7 Final Test Sequence. His name was on the label. He'd never signed off on that test sequence. He'd refused to. He'd written it in a memo. He went home. He picked up Caleb from the neighbor, who watched him after school on late days. He made dinner pasta, nothing complicated. Caleb ate it without commentary, which was the highest form of praise he typically offered. And after Caleb was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table with his father's notebook open in front of him and went through every entry from the last 6 months of his time at Carrington Motors. The dates were there, his handwriting, his calculations, his safety recommendations, and the reasoning behind each one. His refusal to authorize the final test sequence, dated and detailed, was on page 112. Someone had built a case against him out of files he'd never touched and testimony he'd never given. They'd done it carefully and quickly, and they'd done it well enough to end his career, bankrupt his family, and outlast any statute of limitations they'd calculated on. And they'd done it from inside a company that now had a new owner who was, against all odds, starting to look in the right direction. He closed the notebook. He sat in the quiet of his kitchen and listened to the house settle around him, and thought about Daniel Osie's daughter, who would be 5 years old now, growing up without a father because someone had needed a convenient name to attach to a catastrophe they'd caused. He thought about the safety protocol sign-off with his name on it. He thought about Victor Langston, who'd recommended the investigators, who'd pushed for the accelerated timeline, who'd shown up in a garage in the rain looking for a woman like he owned her. He thought about the leather notebook in front of him and the 112 pages inside it, and the exact weight of documented truth versus carefully arranged lies. He made himself go to bed. He lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought, "Not yet. You don't have enough yet. Wait until you have enough." But for the first time in 5 years, he felt like enough was actually something he might reach. The note Asher had left on the senior engineer's desk, the one identifying the load distribution error in the thermal coupling, caused a minor crisis that resolved itself within 48 hours, which was, according to Priya Anand, something of a record. The senior engineer's name was Dominic Reyes, and he was 38 years old and had been at Carrington Motors for 6 years, and had a particular sensitivity about his work that was understandable, given that it was good work, just not quite good enough, this time, in this specific place. He'd come to Asher's office the morning after finding the note with the posture of a man carrying something heavy and trying not to show it. "The load distribution analysis," Dominic said, standing in the doorway. "Yes," Asher said. "You found it in 4 hours. I had the original design files. You were working from a reconstruction. You didn't have the baseline. The error was inherited from the source, not generated by your team." Dominic looked at him for a moment. That doesn't make it feel better. No, Asher agreed. It doesn't, but it means the rest of your modeling is sound, which matters more. It wasn't a performance of generosity, it was just true. Asher had gone through Dominic's team's work that first evening and found it careful and methodical and limited only by the information it was built on. He said so, and Dominic stood in the doorway, processing this with the expression of a man recalibrating a situation he'd entered ready to defend himself in. So where does the fix take us? Dominic asked. Recalculate the stress distribution across the coupling with the corrected baseline, rerun the thermal modeling, and your 3 proposed solutions probably collapse down to 1. Asher turned his notebook around so Dominic could see the page. This configuration, it was in the original design. Dominic looked at the notebook. He looked at Asher. Something shifted in his posture, not warm exactly, not yet, but the particular shift that happens when an engineer looks at another engineer's work and recognizes that it's correct. All right, he said. I'll get the team on it. That was how it started between Asher and the engineering floor, not with warmth, not with easy acceptance, but with the grudging respect of people who care about the work above everything else, and who cannot pretend otherwise when the work is in front of them. By his second week, Asher had identified 3 additional issues in the revival project, none catastrophic, 2 of them meaningful, one of them the kind of small critical thing that gets missed until it becomes a large critical thing at exactly the wrong moment. He documented all of them with the same meticulous precision he'd brought to the original R7 design, and he did it without making anyone feel small, which was harder than it sounded and which he wasn't always entirely successful at. Dominic told him, at the end of the second week, over bad coffee in the engineering break room, "You're not what I expected." What did you expect? Honestly, I expected someone with a grievance. Someone who needed everyone to know they'd been wronged. Asher drank the bad coffee. I was wronged, he said. That doesn't have anything to do with the thermal coupling. Dominic looked at his own cup. No, he said, I suppose it doesn't. The investigation that Priya was running in parallel, quiet, methodical, generating no announcements and no press releases, was moving in a direction that Asher was tracking from a careful distance. She updated him twice a week, always in person, always in her office on the 4th floor with the door closed, because she was careful and she had reason to be. The sign-off document with his name on it, the one authorizing the final test sequence, the one he'd never signed, had been traced through the document management system. The metadata told a story that the visible document tried to hide. The file had been created 11 days before the accident, which was consistent with the official timeline. But it had been accessed and resaved 3 days after the accident from an executive-level terminal on the building's 7th floor. The 7th floor, Asher said, when Priya told him. Executive suite, she said. At the time, that floor was accessed by 7 people with appropriate credentials. 3 have left the company since. 4 are still here. She paused. Victor Langston had standing visitor credentials that gave him 7th floor access. He used the building an average of 4 days a week during that period. Asher sat with that for a moment. You can't prove it was him from the access log alone, he said. No, Priya agreed. The access log tells me the terminal. It doesn't tell me who was sitting at it. She folded her hands on the desk. But I have something else. There's a backup server of an older system partially decommissioned that the IT department stopped actively maintaining about 3 years ago. Files that existed on the main system in 2019 were automatically mirrored to the backup. The main system files were altered. The backup files were not. The silence in the room had weight to it. The backup shows the original safety protocol reports, Asher said. It wasn't a question. The backup shows engineering records that were never submitted to the investigation. Records that include a memo, 2 memos from a senior propulsion engineer recommending the test be postponed with detailed technical reasoning. She looked at him steadily. Your memos, Mr. Beaumont, dated and time-stamped and exactly where you said they should be, in a system that no one thought to alter, because no one thought anyone would look there. He pressed his palms flat on his knees. He breathed carefully. There's more, Priya said. The safety mechanism on the R7 prototype, the physical mechanism, not the documentation. The post-accident report concluded it had failed due to a design flaw. But the wreckage was assessed by an independent firm hired by the board on recommendation from Victor Langston. I found the original physical evidence report, the one filed by the first responders technical team, before Langston's firm was brought in. That report noted something that never appeared in the final investigation, evidence of manual interference with the housing unit of the safety interlock. Mechanical, not electrical. Something that would have had to be done by someone with physical access to the prototype in the hours before the test. Asher stood up. He wasn't aware of deciding to do it. He just found himself standing. Someone disabled it by hand, he said. That's what the original report suggested. That report was not included in the final investigation file. I found it in a physical archive box labeled with a case number that doesn't correspond to any existing case. She held his gaze. Someone removed it deliberately and filed it where it wouldn't be found. He stood at the window of Priya's office and looked out at the parking lot below, the orderly rows of cars in the afternoon light, the ordinary specific reality of a working day at a company that had, 5 years ago, been the instrument of something close to the destruction of everything he had. Daniel Osei, Marcus Webb. 2 men who'd gone to work one morning and not come home because someone had needed to keep a schedule and cover their tracks. Mara, 32 years old, in a hospital bed, telling him it wasn't his fault, in a voice made thin by illness, believing it genuinely, which was somehow harder to carry than if she'd been angry. Caleb, 6 years old, at her funeral, holding Asher's hand and not fully understanding, and therefore not crying, which was worse. How long until you can formalize this? Asher asked. The backup server data is solid. The physical evidence report is solid. The access logs are circumstantial but corroborating. Priya was quiet for a moment. 2 to 3 weeks to compile a package that will hold up to legal scrutiny. I want to be thorough. I don't want to give anyone grounds to dismiss it as. Rushed, Asher said, yes. He turned from the window. 2 to 3 weeks. I know it's been 5 years, she said carefully. 2 to 3 more weeks is fine, he said. I've waited this long. He meant it. He told himself he meant it. He went back to the engineering floor and buried himself in the work, the satisfying, concrete, answerable problems of propulsion engineering, where the laws of physics did not care about anyone's credentials or access logs, where a thing either worked or it didn't, where the math was the math, and he let that absorb him the way it always had, the way it had since he was 19 years old, and fell into engineering the way some people fall into music, with the recognition that this is the thing you do. He was good at it. He'd always been good at it, and the years in the garage hadn't changed that, had maybe sharpened it in the way that exile sometimes sharpens things you thought you'd lost access to. And then, at the end of his 3rd week at Carrington Motors, Helena told him about the gala. She came to his office. She made a point of coming to his office rather than summoning him to hers, which he noticed and said nothing about, and she sat across from his desk with the formal posture of someone delivering news they're not entirely at peace with. The board wants to host a prototype showcase event, she said. End of the month. Investors, executives, press. The R7 Revival Project, as the centerpiece Dominic's team presenting the progress, the revised timeline, the corrected engineering. All right, he said. They want you to attend. He waited. As lead consultant. Publicly. Remarks from you about the technical direction, the safety improvements, the vision behind the original design. She paused. Victor will be there. He still has a significant investor position, and the board hasn't moved to limit his access. That's something I'm working on, but it hasn't happened yet. Asher set down his pen. He looked at her steadily. You're warning me, he said. Yes, you think he'll try something. She considered this with the careful honesty she'd shown him from the beginning. Victor doesn't like situations he can't control. You being here, the photograph, the investigation, none of this is something he anticipated. When he feels cornered, he doesn't retreat, he escalates. She held his gaze. I want you to know what you're walking into, and you can't exclude him. Not without grounds I can't yet formally document. Not yet. He looked at the notebook on his desk. He thought about 2 to 3 weeks, and about the physical evidence report filed in an archive box with a wrong case number, and about the particular patients required to carry something this long without letting it make you reckless. I'll be there, he said. She looked at him, that direct, slightly unsettling quality of attention she had, like she was doing a calculation that wasn't purely professional. You don't have to prove anything to anyone in that room, she said. I know that. I just want you to know that I know it. He looked at her for a moment. In 3 weeks, they'd been in the same building, had spoken daily, had sat across from each other in meetings and in this office, and once in the engineering break room, over the bad coffee. That was everyone's shared complaint, and something had shifted between them that neither of them had addressed. A particular quality of awareness, the way a room changes slightly, when two people in it both notice something and both decide not to say it yet. "Helena," he said. She looked up. "Thank you," he said, "for coming to me directly. About the gala, about Victor, about all of it." "You didn't have to." Something moved in her expression, quick, private, there and gone. "Yes, I did," she said. The gala was held at Carrington Motors' main showcase facility, a space that had been designed at considerable expense to make automotive engineering feel like art. The prototype under development sat on a display platform beneath tracks of warm light, surrounded by the kind of architectural staging that said, "This is a thing worth looking at." The guests were the kind of guests who belonged at these events, people with money and influence who'd learned to wear both easily, who moved through rooms like this with the practiced ease of long habit. Asher wore the one suit he owned, which fit adequately and was a year out of fashion, and which he was aware of in the way you're aware of a stone in your shoe constantly, without being able to fully address it. Dominic and his team presented first. The presentation was good, clean, technically precise, appropriately optimistic without overclaiming. Asher watched from the side of the room and saw Helena standing at the back, near the entrance, and saw the way she scanned the room periodically with the contained alertness of someone watching multiple variables at once. Victor arrived 20 minutes into the presentation. He came in with two men Asher didn't recognize, and the specific bearing of someone who's decided, before entering, that the room owes them something. He was in his 60s, well-preserved in the way that money preserves people gym-built, silver-haired, a face that suggested he'd been handsome once and knew how to trade on the remainder. He scanned the room the way Asher had seen Helena scan it, but with a different quality, not vigilance, but inventory. His eyes found Asher within 30 seconds. He held that eye contact for a long moment, the kind of long that says, "I see you and I am not moved." Then he turned away and began working the room. Asher went back to watching the presentation. After Dominic's team finished, a board member invited Asher to say a few words about the technical legacy of the original program. He had prepared something modest, not self-aggrandizing, not bitter, just technically honest about the original design principles and how they applied to the current work. He stood at the front of the room and spoke for 6 minutes and felt the focused, slightly uncomfortable attention of a room full of people who knew the outline of the story surrounding him, even if they didn't know the details. He finished. There was applause, real applause, not the polite kind. Then Victor spoke. He didn't approach a microphone. He simply raised his voice from where he stood near the bar, with the casual authority of a man accustomed to being heard without effort. "Touching presentation," Victor said. He had the kind of voice that carried in rooms, the kind shaped by decades of making itself impossible to ignore. "I always admire a good comeback story. Man hits rock bottom," he gestured loosely toward Asher, "finds his footing again. Especially when someone with deep pockets extends a hand." The room had gone quiet in the particular way. Rooms go quiet when they sense something is happening that the program didn't schedule. Asher said nothing. The charitable reading, Victor continued, still casual, still pleasant seeming, is that Ms. Carrington saw potential in a disgraced former employee who happened to catch her attention on a rainy night. He smiled not warmly. The more practical reading, of course, is that it was a convenient photograph and a convenient solution to a narrative problem. PR is what it is. He took a sip of his drink. Either way, credit where it's due. Trading a garage mechanic for a consultant is clever repackaging. Silence. Asher felt the room's attention like a physical pressure. He was aware of Dominic to his left, who had gone very still. He was aware of Helena at the back, and he did not look at her. He looked at Victor Langston. "You picked the investigators," Asher said. Victor raised an eyebrow theatrically as if mildly surprised by the topic change. "For the R7 accident investigation," Asher said. His voice was level and unhurried, and clearly audible across the silent room. "You recommended the panel to the board. You had a relationship with the lead investigator professional, going back several years. You've never disclosed that relationship in any formal context." A shift in Victor's posture imperceptible to most people in the room, Asher suspected, but not to him. You also pushed the accelerated test timeline, Asher continued. Twice in writing I've seen the board minutes. 3 times verbally in engineering meetings which were recorded, and those recordings were not submitted to the investigation. He paused. I've been wondering about that. This is hardly the forum, Victor started. You brought up the accident, Asher said simply. In this forum. You told this room that I am here because a woman with money decided to rehabilitate a disgraced mechanic. I'm explaining to this room that what I actually am is an engineer whose safety system was manually disabled by someone with physical access to the prototype the night before a fatal test, and whose documentation was altered 3 days after the accident from a terminal on the 7th floor of this building, using access credentials that were active at that time. He looked directly at Victor. I've been careful not to say your name in that sentence. I've been careful because I don't yet have everything I need to say it responsibly. The room held its breath. But I want to be clear about something, for everyone in this room tonight. He picked up the leather notebook from the table beside him. He'd brought it, had set it there at the start of the evening, and held it up. This is 5 years of my work. Original dates, original calculations, original safety recommendations, including 2 documented refusals to authorize the final test sequence. This notebook is the document that didn't exist in the investigation file, along with 2 memos and a physical evidence report filed by the first response technical team that described mechanical interference with the safety interlock housing, and a backup server record that preserved the original engineering files before they were altered. He set the notebook down. These are not theories. These are documents. The silence had a texture to it. Victor set his glass down. When he spoke, the pleasantness had stripped away, and what was under it was something harder and older, and much less cultivated. You have no idea what you're doing, he said. I know exactly what I'm doing, Asher said. I've known since the night I found the sign-off document with my name on it. I never authorized that test. You know I never authorized it. And the documents that establish that are now in the hands of Carrington Motors' legal and audit teams. He paused. And I'd appreciate it if you didn't use the word mechanic, like it's an insult. I fixed cars for 5 years because it was honest work and my son needed to eat. I'm not ashamed of it. Victor looked across the room at Helena. It was a look that carried history, the specific weight of years of professional entanglement, and the particular message of a man who still believes he has leverage. Helena moved from the back of the room to the front. She crossed the space with the measured pace of someone who has decided exactly what they're doing and has no doubts about it. She came to stand beside Asher, not in front of him, not positioning herself as his spokesperson, just beside him, and she faced the room. I want to address what's been said tonight, she said, in the tone she used in quarterly earnings calls, clear, undeflected. The tone of someone who has decided what is going to happen and is now informing the room of it. Some of you are aware that our audit team has been conducting an internal review of the R7 accident investigation. That review has produced findings that we have shared with the appropriate legal authorities as of this afternoon. She let that land. We will have more to communicate through proper channels in the coming days. Tonight I want to say one thing publicly and clearly. She glanced at Victor and then returned her attention to the room. Carrington Motors is responsible for what happens inside this company. When something happened inside this company that was wrong, that is our responsibility, regardless of who did it, regardless of when it happened, and regardless of who would prefer that it remain buried. Victor's face had the quality of a man rapidly recalculating. Victor, Helena said, quietly now, just to him, though the room heard it. Your investor position will be reviewed. I'd suggest you consult your attorney. He looked at her. He looked at Asher. He looked around the room at the faces of people he'd worked with for years, none of which were offering him anything he could use. He picked up his jacket from the chair behind him, and he left. The room absorbed his absence in silence for a moment. Then someone Asher never found out who started clapping. Not the polite kind. Afterward, when the guests had migrated back toward conversation, and the bar and the careful normalization of a room after a charged moment, Asher found a corridor off the main showcase floor and stood in it and pressed his back against the wall and just breathed. His hands were steady. He was surprised to find they were steady. He heard footsteps, and Helena appeared around the corner. She stopped when she saw him, and for a moment they just looked at each other the way people look at each other after something significant has just happened in front of them. You had all of that ready, she said. You knew he'd try something. I thought he might. I came prepared. She leaned against the opposite wall and looked at him with an expression he was starting to recognize, the one that sat behind the CEO composure, the one that was more unguarded and more tired and considerably more real. How are you? It was such a simple question, and she asked it simply, without performance, and it caught him slightly off balance in the way simple, genuine things do when you're not expecting them. I'm all right, he said. Then, more honestly, I've been carrying that for 5 years. Saying it out loud in a room full of people it's different from knowing it yourself. Different how? He thought about it. Lighter, he said. Oddly lighter. She looked at him for a long moment. The corridor was quiet, just the muffled sound of the event beyond it. Asher, she said. Yes. I'm sorry. She said it plainly, without legal qualification, without the kind of corporate hedging she'd probably been advised to maintain. Not as Carrington Motors, as a person who is sorry for what happened to you, and to your wife, and to those men and their families. I'm sorry it happened, and I'm sorry it was 5 years before anyone looked at it properly. He looked at the floor for a moment, at the particular blankness of the corridor floor, expensive and neutral. Thank you, he said. Does it? She stopped herself. Does it what? I was going to ask if it helps, she said. Which is an unfair question and none of my business. It helps some things, he said carefully. It doesn't help other things. She nodded. She understood that he could see that she understood it, not as abstraction, but as something she'd lived with in some version of her own. They stood in the corridor for another moment, and the quality of the silence between them was the particular kind that has nothing uncomfortable in it, which was strange given how much between them was still unresolved and complicated and heavy with history. Caleb wanted me to tell you, Asher said somewhat out of nowhere, not the thing he'd planned to say, that the design models in the showcase display have a label error. He noticed it when I brought him to see the facility last week. He says the compression ratio on the diagram is off by a factor of 10. Helena blinked. Then something in her face loosened the way faces loosen, when they weren't expecting to smile and did anyway. He's 9, she said. He reads everything with numbers in it, Asher said. He can't help it, is he right? I checked. Yes. She laughed, a real one, brief and surprised. He thought it was probably not an expression many people in that building had seen from her, and he was aware of the specific warmth of being the person who'd caused it. The moment sat between them, and he let it, and he didn't reach for it or name it. Just let it exist the way you let certain things exist, because trying to hold them too firmly is the thing that makes them go away. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it, the neighbor who watched Caleb on late nights, sending a check-in text. I have to get back, he said. Of course. She straightened from the wall. The composure resettled over her shoulders, like something she knew how to put back on. Asher, he looked at her. What you said in there, she said. About the garage. About it being honest work, she paused. I've been in rooms full of impressive people my entire adult life. I don't know that I've met many of them who could have said that without either defensiveness or performance. He looked at her for a moment. It was just true, he said. He walked back through the showcase floor, collecting his notebook from the table, nodding once to Dominic as he passed, and went out into the night air, which was cool, and smelled of rain still an hour or two away, and stood briefly at the parking lot's edge before walking to his 11-year-old truck with the bumper held on by 2 bolts and optimism. He sat in the driver's seat and didn't start the engine immediately. In the building behind him, Priya Anand was already on the phone with the legal team, and the documentation, the backup server files, the physical evidence report, the access logs, the memos with his name and date, and the careful recorded reasoning of a 32-year-old engineer who'd known a disaster was coming and had said so and been ignored. All of it was moving through official channels now, past the point where any single person's influence could stop it. He thought about Victor Langston walking out of that room. He thought about the particular expression on Victor's face, not rage, which Asher had expected, but something more raw, more naked, the expression of a man who has believed, for 5 years, that the ground he's standing on is solid, and has just heard something shift underneath it. He thought about Daniel Osie's daughter, who was 5 years old, and whose father's name was on the documentation now in legal hands. He thought about Mara, who would have known exactly what to say and when to say it, who would have sat across from him in this parking lot and asked him precisely the right question, and then listened to the answer with the complete attention she'd always given everything. He let himself think about her without trying to manage it, which was still hard but less sharp than it used to be, worn softer by time the way edges get worn, not gone, just different. Then he started the truck and drove home through the beginning edge of the promised rain, and Caleb was asleep when he got in, and the house was quiet and warm and exactly the size of his real life, and he thought that was all right. More than all right. He stood in the kitchen and felt the particular stillness of a night when something large has shifted, and did not try to name what came next, and went to bed. The rain that had been threatening all evening finally arrived sometime around 3 a.m, and Asher lay awake listening to it against the window, the way he'd listened to rain his whole life, not with dread, not with comfort exactly. Just with the attention you give to something that doesn't require anything of you. He thought about the gala, not with the replaying, second-guessing quality that used to accompany big moments, but with the slower, more settled examination of someone who did what he meant to do and is now living in the aftermath of it. He'd said the things he'd needed to say. Victor had walked out of the room. The documentation was in motion. None of that felt triumphant. It felt closer to the particular exhaustion of putting down something very heavy after a very long walk. He fell asleep around 4 and woke at 6:30 to Caleb standing in his doorway in the spacecraft pajamas. "There's no milk," Caleb announced. "There's orange juice." "I don't want orange juice. I want cereal." Cereal without milk is just crunchy bread. Caleb considered this philosophical framing with the expression of someone who suspects they're being managed. "Can we get milk?" "Corner store opens at 7. It's 7:03. Asher lay there for another moment, staring at the ceiling, conducting a brief internal inventory of what his body wanted, which was more sleep versus what the morning required. The morning won, the way mornings usually do. He pushed himself up, found a shirt on the chair, pulled it on inside out, didn't notice until Caleb pointed it out on the walk to the corner store, chose not to fix it. They walked back with milk and a box of the cereal Caleb liked, which had a cartoon on the front and more sugar per serving than Asher preferred to think about too carefully. The morning was pale and washed clean from the rain, and the street was quiet, and for approximately 8 minutes, nothing required any of Asher's attention except putting one foot in front of the other beside his son. Caleb said, without preamble, "My teacher showed the class something online yesterday." Asher glanced at him. "About you," Caleb said, "about the gala thing." Someone filmed some of it. Of course someone had filmed it. Asher had not thought about this, which in retrospect was naive. "What did your teacher say?" "She said it was important." Caleb was quiet for half a block. "She said sometimes people have to wait a long time before the truth comes out." Asher said nothing. "Is that what happened?" Caleb asked. "With Mom dying and everything? You had to wait?" The morning air was cool and the cereal box was under Asher's arm, and his kid was looking up at him with gray-green eyes that asked questions most adults would know to dress up in softer language, and he thought, this is the conversation. Not a practice version, this is it. "Yeah," he said. "Something like that. Are you still waiting?" "No," he said. "I think the waiting part is mostly over." Caleb absorbed this. They turned onto their street. "Is the lady going to help? Helena?" "She already has." "Is she your girlfriend?" "Caleb. I'm just asking. She's someone I work with. You don't look at people you work with the same way." Asher stopped walking. He looked at his son, who looked back at him with the complete candor of someone who has not yet learned that some observations are impolite to share. "What way?" Asher asked, because he was apparently going to have this conversation in the middle of the sidewalk at 7 a.m. Caleb shrugged with one shoulder. "Like you're trying to figure something out." Asher started walking again. "Finish your cereal when we get inside," he said. "We haven't started it yet, then start it and finish it." Caleb grinned, not a taunting grin, just the grin of a kid who knows he landed something and is smart enough not to push it further. He ran ahead to the front door, and Asher followed at a pace that gave him approximately 30 seconds to have the interior conversation about the fact that his 9-year-old son apparently perceived things that Asher had been carefully, almost successfully, not perceiving about himself. The formal board croissant came 4 days after the gala, in the form of a document that Asher's attorney, a methodical woman named Sandra Chu, who had been his neighbor's recommendation, and who had taken the case on a reduced fee because, As she told him plainly, she wanted to be part of it reviewed overnight, and returned with annotations and a phone call that lasted 40 minutes. The document was a formal exoneration, his engineering record restored, his license reinstated effective immediately, his original intellectual property rights over the R7 propulsion system design acknowledged. The board had also approved a financial settlement meaningful, not obscene, the kind of number that didn't erase what had happened, but acknowledged its cost in terms that required actual commitment. There's a second component, Sandra told him, separate from the settlement. Ms. Carrington is proposing it personally, not on behalf of the board. She wants your approval before it's formalized. He listened. The proposal was a trust funded independently by Helena, not by Carrington Motors designated for the families of Daniel Ossie and Marcus Webb. Education funds for children, medical coverage, retroactive compensation for years of lost income. Not charity in the way of a corporation trying to limit liability, but support structured around what those families had actually lost and what they still needed. He sat in his kitchen with the phone against his ear, and Sandra's voice receding slightly as he thought about Daniel Ossie's daughter, who would be in kindergarten now, who had never known her father, who had grown up in a world where the catastrophe that made her fatherless had been attributed to a mistake made by a man who'd spent 5 years in a garage fixing other people's cars. Tell her yes, he said. You want to review the specifics? Tell her yes, and I'll review the specifics after. But tell her yes now. Sandra paused. All right. He went to Carrington Motors that afternoon, not because he was summoned, but because he had work to do, and because the engineering floor had become, in the weeks he'd spent there, something closer to familiar than he'd expected. He stopped by Priya's office. She was already on to the next thing. The way thorough people are the R7 investigation had been handed to external legal authorities, and she'd moved to a systemic audit of safety reporting procedures across the company's manufacturing operations, her desk covered in a new layer of organized chaos. The external investigators confirmed the backup server data this morning, she said, without looking up. Officially on record, Victor's attorneys will be served this week. Right, he said. She looked up. How are you? You're the second person to ask me that recently. It's a reasonable question given the circumstances. I know. He leaned against the doorframe. I'm not sure what I am. Relieved, maybe. But relief isn't the right word, because the wrong word implies it replaces something, and it doesn't. Priya looked at him with the direct, unsentimental attention that was her characteristic mode. Nothing replaces what you lost, she said simply. But you can be relieved about this thing specifically without it being required to fix everything. He considered this. That's accurate. I'm good at accurate, she said, and turned back to her work in a way that was clearly also a dismissal, which he appreciated. He went to the engineering floor. Dominic was at the main workstation with 2 members of his team, the prototype on the table in front of them, in partial disassembly, the thermal coupling section that Asher had identified the flaw in, now corrected and integrated into the revised design. Asher pulled up a stool and they worked through the afternoon on the revised stress models, and it was the particular kind of work he'd missed in ways he hadn't let himself examine. The kind that requires your complete mind, and therefore gives it a rest from everything else. Around 4, Dominic said without looking up from his screen the exoneration thing. I saw the board announcement. Yes, Asher said. I worked here when the accident happened, Dominic said. I was junior staff then, not in your division. But I remember the investigation. I remember the file. He paused. I remember thinking it seemed fast. 11 days is fast. Yes, Asher said again. I should have thought harder about it, Dominic said. There was no drama in it, just the specific discomfort of a person sitting with a retrospective moral accounting. I was 28 and trying to keep my head down. I didn't ask questions. Asher looked at him. You didn't cause it. No, but I didn't question it either. Most people didn't. That was part of the design. He turned back to the screen. You're questioning it now. That's not nothing. They worked in silence for a while, which was the kind of silence that has already said what it needed to say. Helena came to the garage on a Saturday. Asher was under a customer's minivan, a regular, a woman named Ruth, who brought the van in every 3 months with the same patient optimism that it would require something minimal, and every 3 months it required something meaningful. And Ruth received this news each time with the philosophical resignation of someone who has accepted the fundamental unreliability of old machinery. He heard a car in the drive and slid out, expecting Ruth herself to check on the progress report. Helena was standing in the bay entrance in jeans and a jacket plain clothes, the kind you wear when you're not being a CEO, which sat slightly differently on her than the structured professional wear, more comfortable and somehow more uncertain at the same time. She had no coffee cups, no business card, nothing prepared. She was standing there with her hands in her jacket pockets, the way people stand when they haven't fully decided what they came to say. "You're here," Asher said. She stopped. "I'm not sure exactly what I wanted. I wanted to make sure you were all right. Not as you're," she paused. "I don't actually have a professional title for what I am to you right now." "Neither do I," he said. They looked at each other. Caleb appeared from the back of the garage with a book and a half-eaten apple and stopped when he saw Helena, and then looked at his father with the expression Asher was coming to recognize as his son's version of careful neutrality, the one that meant, "I notice things, and I am choosing to be polite about them." "Hi," Caleb said to Helena. "Hi." She looked at the book under his arm. It was a thick thing, the kind of technical volume that doesn't belong in the hands of a 9-year-old, unless the 9-year-old in question has very particular interests. "What are you reading?" Caleb held it up. "Mechanical Engineering Fundamentals. It's from the library. Dad said I could renew it 2 more times." "Do you understand all of it?" Caleb considered whether this was a condescending question or a genuine one, apparently decided it was genuine, and answered honestly, "Most of it. The math in Chapter 7 is hard. Dad helps." Helena glanced at Asher. There was something in her expression, soft, private, present for only a second, before she put it back, that he filed away without examining immediately. "Could I look at it?" she asked Caleb. Chapter 7. Caleb looked briefly suspicious, then handed it over. She opened it to the indicated chapter and looked at it for a moment with the focused attention she brought to everything, and said, "The problem is the notation. The way they've written the variable here," she pointed, "is inconsistent with how it's defined 2 pages earlier. Once you catch that inconsistency, the rest of it resolves." Caleb took the book back and looked at the page with the specific intensity of a kid who's been working at something, and just had it become slightly clearer. "Oh," he said. A pause. "That's annoying. Engineering textbooks frequently are," she said. Something shifted in Caleb's posture, the careful neutrality relaxing by a degree. He looked at his father, and the look was not the opaque coded communication of children protecting their loyalties, but something more open, a question, or the beginning of an answer to one. Asher said, "Take your book inside and finish the chapter. I'll call you when I need the engine started." Caleb went, and the garage was quiet except for the radio that Asher kept on low, something oldish and instrumental that he'd never identified, and the sound of the street outside. Helena remained near the bay entrance, not quite committing to being inside or outside. "The settlement," she said, "and the trust. I wanted to say those weren't, I didn't do those things to." She stopped again, which was unusual for her, and she seemed to know it was unusual, and that slight self-awareness sat visibly in her expression. "I'm not trying to purchase anything with them. I wanted you to know that." "I know that," he said. The board pushed for a structure that would have been tied to a broader PR release. "I rejected it. What's in those documents has nothing to do with press strategy. It's just correct. It's what should have happened 5 years ago, and didn't." He looked at her. "Helena." "I know," she met his eyes. She held them for a moment, and in her expression was the specific combination of things that she usually kept in separate compartments, the executive composure, and the more unguarded thing underneath it, both visible at once. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "That you don't have to answer?" "Yes. When you left my garage that first morning, after I told you what happened, you didn't apologize again. You didn't offer money. You asked who ran the investigation." He paused. That was the right question. Most people wouldn't have asked it. "Why did you?" She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, it was in the more deliberate way of someone choosing accuracy over comfort. "Because I've spent 20 years in rooms full of people constructing narratives about why something unfortunate was inevitable or acceptable or someone else's fault," she said. "And I know what a constructed narrative sounds like. It has a particular completeness. Everything fits too cleanly. The R7 file fit too cleanly." She paused. And because Victor was there the night I came into your garage, and I've known Victor for 15 years, and I know what he looks like when he's afraid versus when he's angry. In that garage, when he saw you, he was afraid. I didn't understand why yet, but I filed it. He looked at her for a long moment. You've been putting this together longer than I realized. I've been putting Victor together for a while, she said carefully. The night in the garage gave me the part I was missing. He absorbed that. Outside, a car passed. The radio changed to something with a guitar in it. What do you do? He said. When you've spent so long managing things, your company, your image, the room that you can't remember what you actually wanted before all the managing started. She looked at him directly. The question had surprised her, he could see that. Not uncomfortably, but in the way of someone who wasn't expecting someone else to see something that specifically. I'm working on that, she said quietly. So am I, he said. The afternoon light came in through the bay at the low angle of late October, and it lay across the garage floor in long rectangles, and they stood in the specific quiet of two people who have arrived at the edge of something and are both aware of it, and neither is quite ready to step forward yet, and neither needs the other to pretend otherwise. Caleb said you looked at him differently, Asher said. Helena blinked. Pardon? He said when you helped him with the textbook. He told me later you looked at him like he was an actual person and not a child who needed to be managed. He paused. He doesn't say that about many people. Something moved in her face, real and unguarded, and slightly pained. I don't have a lot of experience with children, she said. I've spent most of my adult life in professional environments where warmth is generally weaponized. You learn to be careful with it. She paused. With Caleb, I don't feel the need to be careful. He's just straightforwardly himself. Yes, Asher said. He is. He gets that from somewhere, she said, and her voice was quieter when she said it, and she was looking at him when she said it, and he let that sit without deflecting. He went back under the van, not because the moment needed ending, but because the van needed finishing and Ruth needed her car. And that was the other thing about his life. The work kept coming, the real, ordinary work, and he'd learned to appreciate that, the way it grounded things. Helena stayed. She found the stool he kept near the workbench, and she sat on it, and they talked while he worked not about Victor or the investigation or Carrington Motors, but about other things. She told him about learning to drive in a parking lot at 14 with her father, who was a difficult man but had been patient about that specific thing. He told her about the first engine he'd ever taken apart, his uncle's old Ford, age 12, in a driveway in Ohio, and the panic when it didn't go back together the way it came apart, and the 3 days it took to figure out what he'd done wrong. She laughed at that. He could hear it even from under the van. Caleb came back out around 5, drawn by the smell of the oil and the voices and the comfortable animal magnetism of an interesting situation. He sat on the floor near Helena's stool with his book and read, and occasionally asked one of them a question about what he'd just read. And the afternoon closed around the three of them, a 9-year-old, and a mechanic and a billionaire, in the unforced way of a thing that isn't being arranged. When Asher finally finished, slid out from under the van, and stood up, his back registering its opinions about the past 3 hours in the way backs do after 40, Helena was showing Caleb something on her phone, an engineering diagram of some kind, apparently related to the Chapter 7 problem, which she'd found and forwarded to herself and enlarged for him to see. Caleb was frowning at it with the forward tilt and the narrowed eyes. Asher washed his hands at the utility sink and watched them without making a production of it. This was the thing he hadn't expected. Not the investigation resolving, not the exoneration he'd believed those things were possible eventually, with enough pressure and luck. He hadn't expected this specific thing, his son, sitting on a garage floor with a borrowed textbook, working through a math problem with a woman who'd walked into their lives through a rainstorm in a desperate moment, and the three of them in the same space without it feeling like an imposition or a pretense. It felt like something else. He wasn't ready to name it. He didn't think naming it would serve it, not yet. But he felt it, clearly, the way you feel a temperature change, not dramatic, just real. The specific reality of warmth, replacing something that had been cold for long enough that you'd stopped fully registering the cold. Later, after Helena left, she had a call. She said she was working on restructuring 2 board positions. There was always something Caleb was quiet through dinner in the way that meant he was thinking rather than upset. Dad, he said finally, over the last of his pasta. Yeah, Is she lonely? Asher looked at him. What makes you ask that? She smiled like she wasn't used to it, Caleb said. The real kind of smiling. Like she'd forgotten it was something she could do. Asher sat with that for a moment. 9 years old, he thought. 9 years old, and he saw it the thing that Asher had noticed and hadn't said, the quality underneath Helena's competence and composure, that was the particular loneliness of someone who has spent so long being impressive to people that they've lost the thread of being known by them. Maybe, Asher said. We could invite her for dinner sometime, Caleb said, with the casual pragmatism of a child solving a problem. I can make the pasta. I know how to make the pasta. You know how to boil water, Asher said. That's most of pasta. He looked at his son across the kitchen table, at the gray-green eyes that were his mother's, and the set of the jaw that was Asher's, and the general quality of this kid who had grown up in a garage in a small house in the absence of things, and who had come out of it with an open generosity that Asher took no credit for and was grateful for every day. I'll think about it, he said. 2 weeks after the gala, Victor Langston was formally removed from the Carrington Motors Investor Board following the initiation of a civil fraud investigation, and, 3 days later, a criminal referral from the district attorney's office, based in part on the physical evidence report that Priya's team had recovered, and in part on testimony from 2 former Carrington executives who'd had, apparently, a great deal to say once the protection of institutional silence was removed from the equation. Asher got the news from Sandra, who called in the morning while he was walking Caleb to school. He stopped on the sidewalk and listened, and Caleb stopped beside him and looked up at his face. What is it? Caleb asked. The legal process started, Asher said. For the people responsible for what happened 5 years ago. Caleb thought about this. Is that good? Yes, Asher said. It's good, but you don't look happy. It's not a happy thing. It's a right thing. Those are different. He looked down at his son. The people Daniel Osie's daughter is going to tell about her father. They're going to know he didn't do anything wrong. That's what matters. Caleb turned this over in his mind with the patient thoroughness he brought to everything complex. Then he nodded, not agreeing exactly, just receiving it, and they kept walking. Helena called that afternoon. You've heard, she said. Sandra called. I wanted to call myself. A pause. Are you all right? He was sitting in the office at the garage between appointments, a narrow room that was mostly shelves and a second-hand desk, and the accumulated paperwork of a small business, and through the door he could hear the ordinary sounds of the street outside. I keep getting asked that, he said. I know, I'll stop asking. No, he said, don't. He paused. I'm all right. It doesn't feel the way I thought it would feel. I thought it would feel like an ending. Does it? He looked out the window at the street. A woman walked past with a stroller. A delivery truck idled at the corner. An ordinary afternoon in an ordinary neighborhood. It feels like the end of one thing, he said. But one thing is it's a lot. Yes, she said quietly. A silence, but the kind without pressure. Caleb wants to have you for dinner, Asher said. He says he knows how to make pasta. A beet. He boils water, Asher added. That's technically most of pasta. He heard her breath change, not quite a laugh, but close. That specific almost law, the one she made when something caught her off guard in a way she liked. Tell him I accept, she said. Saturday. He hung up and sat in his office for a moment, and he felt the particular quality of a life that is not fixed, never fixed, that's not how lives work, but moving. A life that is accumulating rather than diminishing. A life that has forward direction. He thought about Mara, because he thought about Mara every day, and he had stopped trying not to, had stopped treating it as something to manage. He carried her with him the way you carried people who shaped you. She would have hated Victor Langston on sight. She would have had 15 opinions about Helena, formed in the first 20 minutes, most of them accurate. She would have made Asher explain his feelings back to her until he could do it without his vocabulary going blunt. He was not done missing her. He didn't think he was supposed to be. But he was here in this chair, in this room, with his license back and his name clean and his son walking to school safe and fed. And on Saturday, a woman who had helped carry the weight of the last 5 years was coming to dinner to eat pasta made mostly of boiled water. And the world outside his window was ordinary and specific and real. He pulled the latest engineering file for the R7 revival toward him. He had a propulsion system to finish. He'd been working toward it for 5 years longer. Really, if you counted the original work, the years of calculations and safety protocols and design refinements that had lived in a leather notebook through everything. He picked up his pen and got back to it. The work kept coming, and he was glad for it. The pasta was, by any reasonable standard, a partial disaster. Caleb had studied the process with the focused seriousness he brought to engineering textbooks, had watched 2 videos online, and taken notes, actual written notes. In the small spiral notebook he used for things he considered important, and had still managed to slightly overcook the noodles and undersalt the sauce, which was a store-bought jar. He'd insisted on selecting himself from the grocery store based on the label's ingredient list. He'd compared 4 brands before deciding. Helena arrived at 6:15 with a bottle of sparkling water and a book, a structural engineering primer, more advanced than Caleb's library copy, which she set on the counter without ceremony and said was for him if he wanted it. Not a gift exactly, just a book she thought he'd use. Caleb looked at it the way he looked at everything that interested him, that forward tilt, the slight narrowing of focus, and said, "Thank you," with an authenticity that was recognizable precisely because it wasn't performed. They ate at the small kitchen table, the 3 of them, with the overhead light slightly too bright the way overhead lights are in kitchens that weren't designed by people who thought about ambiance, and the pasta was soft in a way that spoke to Caleb's optimism about cooking times, and the sauce was fine, and none of it mattered because the table was warm and the conversation was real. And Helena sat in a chair in a mechanic's kitchen, in a pair of dark jeans, eating overcooked pasta, with a 9-year-old who was telling her, with complete conviction, about the structural inefficiencies he'd identified in the city's 2 largest bridges based on photographs he'd found online. The secondary load bearing on the northern span, Caleb said, pointing at nothing in particular with his fork, uses a design that was already outdated when they built it. I looked it up. Helena listened with the quality of attention she brought to board presentations, full, unperformed, the kind that meant she was actually processing, rather than waiting for her turn to speak. "What would you do differently?" she asked. Caleb thought about it with his mouth still slightly full, which Asher let pass because this was not the hill. "Cable stay configuration," Caleb said finally. "More efficient load distribution, better wind resistance, and you can inspect it without closing the bridge." Helena looked at Asher. The look said, "Where did this child come from?" Asher shrugged. "He reads," he said simply. After dinner, Caleb retreated to his room with the new book. He'd been wanting to do this since it arrived, had shown heroic patience through the meal, and Asher washed the dishes while Helena sat at the table with a cup of tea, in the particular relaxed quality of someone who doesn't relax often and therefore notices it when it happens. "You're not going to tell me not to get him the book," she said. "Not a question. Why would I? Some people think it's overstepping. Coming into someone's home with a gift for their child." Asher turned the water off. He dried his hands on the dish towel and turned around and leaned against the counter. "He needed the book. You knew he needed the book. That's the whole story." She looked at him across the kitchen. Outside, the street was quiet, a Friday night in a neighborhood that went to bed at a reasonable hour, where the loudest thing was occasionally someone's television through a window. "I spent a lot of years," Helena said, "being careful about what I wanted." "I know," he said. "Not strategically careful, the other kind. The kind where you stop letting yourself want things, because wanting things in the wrong direction, in the wrong relationship, toward the wrong person has consequences that extend past yourself. I have a company. 11,000 people. The wanting has to be managed." He looked at her steadily. "I'm telling you this because I don't want to manage it with you," she said. "And that frightens me a little, which is why I'm saying it out loud, rather than letting it live in my head where I can keep organizing it." He crossed the kitchen. Not quickly, he moved across the floor of his own home at the pace of a man who is sure of what he's doing, which was not a feeling he'd had often in the last 5 years. He sat down in the chair across from her and put his forearms on the table and looked at her directly. "Helena," he said. "Yes, I'm 32 years old," he said. "You're 50. I'm aware. I have a 9-year-old and a garage and a mortgage I've almost caught up on. Also aware, I was angry at your company for 5 years. Some of that anger still lives in me. Not at you, I know the difference. But it's there. I know that too. And Mara," he stopped. Started again. "I'm not done carrying her. I'm not going to be done. She was my wife, and she was 32, and I don't get to just set that down because something good is happening. I'm not asking you to set it down, she said, and her voice was quiet and completely certain. I'm not a replacement. I'm not a chapter that comes after and erases the previous one. I know who you are, Asher. I know what you've been carrying. I don't want you to put it down. She paused. I'd like to be something you're also carrying, if that makes sense. The kitchen was very quiet. It makes sense, he said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, just that, just his hand over her hand, nothing dramatic about it. She looked down at it and then back at him, and what was in her face was the specific expression of a woman who has been composed and controlled and managed and impressive for so long that being seen simply, without any of the apparatus, cost her something real. I don't know how to do this, she said. Neither do I, he said. I haven't done it in a long time. What if we're bad at it? Then we're bad at it, he said, and we figure out where it went wrong and we try again. That's generally how things work. She laughed, that real one, the brief surprised kind, and turned her hand under his, so they were palm to palm. They sat like that in the kitchen of a small house on an ordinary street, and through the wall came the faint sound of Caleb in his room turning pages, and the street outside was quiet, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and neither of them needed to. The R7 prototype was completed in the spring. Not without difficulty. Not without the 3 additional problems that emerged in the final phase of integration. A calibration issue with the electronic management system that took 2 weeks to isolate. A materials failure in a non-critical housing component that required a supplier change. And a software conflict that Dominic's team spent 4 days on, before Asher looked at it for 40 minutes and found the conflict buried in a parameter definition nobody had touched because nobody had known it needed touching. The work was hard and specific and real, and Asher led it the way he'd always led it, not from above but from inside, at the workbench and under the hood and in the data, present for the failures as much as the progress. Because that's where you learn what you actually built. On the morning of the demonstration test, Asher was at the facility at 5:30. He walked the prototype once, alone, in the empty test bay, going over every component with the calm, systematic attention of a man performing a ritual he'd been developing since he was 20 years old. He checked the safety systems last each one, manually, in sequence, and what he felt as he worked through the checklist was not the fear that used to accompany this process, the awareness of how wrong things could go, but something steadier. Not confidence in the arrogant sense, but the particular assurance of a person who has done the work, checked the work, understood the work from its foundation. He'd designed the safety protocols on the original R7. He'd redesigned and strengthened them on this one, incorporating everything he'd learned, from understanding exactly how and why the original had been sabotaged. Daniel Osei and Marcus Webb. He thought about them while he checked the final interlock. He thought about them the way he always thought about them in these moments, not with the crushing guilt that used to accompany it, now that the truth of the accident had been formally established and documented and entered into legal record. But with the specific gravity of remembering that engineering is not abstract, that the systems you design and the protocols you establish and the standards you refuse to compromise exist in the real world, where the consequences of failure are measured in people. That was the thing he wanted every engineer on his team to understand, and he'd said it to them plainly in the first week. This work matters because people are inside it. The math is the math, and the physics is the physics, and those things are clean and bounded. But the reason those things matter is always human, and you never get to forget that. The demonstration was attended by the board, by media, by industry representatives, and by a small number of people. Asher had personally invited Sandra, his attorney, Priya, who stood near the back with her arms folded and watched the proceedings, with the expression of someone who has done the serious work and is now willing to observe the celebration, Ruth, whose van he'd been keeping operational for 3 years, and who had received the invitation with the bewildered good nature of a person who doesn't fully understand why they're there, but is glad to be included. Helena sat in the front row. The prototype ran. It ran with the particular clean authority of a machine that has been built correctly, all the way down, no compromises in the places that mattered. The performance data came in above projection on 3 of the 4 key metrics, and exactly at projection on the 4th. And Dominic, who was monitoring the readouts at the station beside Asher, let out a breath that he'd apparently been holding for most of the test sequence. "That's it," Dominic said quietly. That's it, Asher agreed. There was applause from the observation area, the genuine kind, the kind that has relief in it, as well as appreciation. Helena was standing. She'd stood up before the applause started, which Asher caught and which she didn't seem to notice she'd done. He looked at her across the test bay, and she looked back at him, and neither of them performed anything for the room. They just looked at each other, the way people look at each other when something they both worked for, and both doubted at different moments, has just, against the reasonable probability of complicated things, worked. Caleb was there too. Asher had brought him, had explained what the day was, had sat with him the evening before, and talked about what the prototype represented and what it had cost to get here. Caleb had listened with the specific stillness he got when he was absorbing something important, and then had asked if he could see the propulsion system schematics, which Asher had shown him, and which Caleb had studied for 30 minutes before going to bed. Now Caleb was standing with Ruth. They'd somehow found each other and were deep in what appeared to be a genuine conversation. Ruth talking with her hands the way she always did. Caleb nodding with the focused interest he brought to anyone who was willing to tell him something real. Asher watched his son and felt the complicated, unnameable thing that parents feel when they see their children in the world, that mixture of pride and terror and love that doesn't have clean edges, that overflows whatever container you try to keep it in. After the demonstration, when the formal part of the day had wound down and people were filing into the reception area adjacent to the test bay, Asher stopped beside the prototype. He put one hand on the housing warm from the run, the metal carrying the specific heat of something that has just done the work it was designed for. He thought, I built this. I built it the first time and I built it again, and this time it ran, and no one got hurt. He didn't say it to anyone. He just thought it, standing alone with the machine in the emptying bay, and let it be enough. The Renewal Engineering Center opened 7 months later. It had been Asher's condition not stated as a negotiation tactic, not leveraged against the settlement or the formal restoration of his career, but stated plainly as the thing he actually wanted. He'd sat across from Helena and the board and told them, I want to build something for people who fell through the cracks. Displaced workers, single parents who lost careers to circumstances they didn't control, engineers and technicians who need retraining, who need a path back in. People like Daniel Osie's daughter might be when she grows up and wants to work in this industry, and finds the door harder to open because of what happened to her father. Helena had funded it. The board had contributed. 3 industry partners had come in after Helena made specific calls, the kind of calls she made when she'd decided something was going to happen, and was now informing the relevant parties of that decision. The center occupied a building 2 miles from Asher's garage. It was not glamorous. It was a converted warehouse space with good lighting and proper ventilation and workbenches that were solid rather than beautiful, and an open floor plan designed for the actual activities of learning rather than the appearance of them. On the wall near the entrance was a list of names, not the donors, not the board members, not the executives. The families of Daniel Osie and Marcus Webb. Their names and a sentence, this place exists because they should not be forgotten. Asher had written the sentence himself. He'd written about 12 versions of it over the course of 2 evenings before arriving at that one, which was the plainest and therefore the right one. The opening day was attended by more people than Asher had expected workers and their families, some of whom had been through the specific experience of losing a career to a corporate catastrophe and having nowhere to put the pieces afterward, who'd heard about the center through a network he hadn't entirely tracked. They came with the particular wariness of people who'd been promised things before and were waiting to see whether this was the same kind of promise or a different kind. Asher spoke briefly. He was not a natural public speaker. He was too direct for it, too impatient with the performance aspects, but he was honest, which was better. He said, I spent 5 years in a garage because I had no other option. During those years, I became a better mechanic than I ever expected to be, and I was lucky enough to have a son who needed me present, and a neighbor who helped me keep him fed, and a community that treated us like people rather than a cautionary story. Not everyone has those things. This center is for the people who don't. He said, engineering is not about credentials, ultimately. It's about understanding how things work and caring enough to do it right. We are interested in people who care enough. We'll teach the rest. He said, 2 men died because someone decided a schedule mattered more than their lives. I think about that every day. I think the best thing I can do with that is make sure the people who come through this door know that their work matters not because it's impressive, not because it's profitable, but because someone is going to be inside it. He stopped there. He'd written more, but standing in the room, looking at the faces looking back at him, that felt like the place to stop. Helena was in the back of the room. She'd insisted on it, had told him before they arrived, that this was his day, and she was not going to stand at the front of it. She was leaning against the wall in that posture she got when she was listening fully, arms folded loosely, and when he caught her eyes across the room, she gave him one small, contained nod that said everything it needed to say. Victor Langston was convicted 11 months after the gala. The trial was not short and was not clean. These things never are, and Asher had spent enough time with Sandra to understand that the legal process was its own machinery, slow and grinding and occasionally maddening, prone to delays and maneuvers and days that seemed to move nowhere. He'd attended the portions that were relevant to his testimony, given his account clearly, and without embellishment, answered every question from the defense the same way directly, factually, without visible anger, which he suspected unnerved them more than anger would have. The verdict came on a Tuesday morning, and Sandra called him while he was under a truck, Ruth's van again, because the van was apparently immortal and committed to requiring his attention in perpetuity. He slid out and answered the phone. Sandra said 2 words. He sat on the garage floor with his back against the van's side and his legs stretched out in front of him and his phone in his hand. And he looked at the ceiling of his garage, the water stain in the corner he'd been meaning to patch, the bare bulb in its wire cage, the pegboard of tools he'd arranged and rearranged over 5 years until the arrangement was exactly right, and he breathed. He didn't cry. He'd thought he might when this moment came, and then he didn't. What he felt was quieter than crying a settling, like something that had been held at an angle for a very long time being allowed to rest flat. He called Helena. "I heard," she said before he could speak. Her voice was careful. "Are you all right?" "Yes," he said. And for the first time in 5 years, when he said it, it was simply true. She was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about what you said." "At the opening." "Which part?" "About caring enough. About that being the thing that matters." "I meant it." "I know you did." She paused. "I think I'd forgotten that. I'd been running a company for so long that I'd started measuring by the metrics the company uses: revenue, market position, growth rate. The things that are real but aren't the whole reality." Another pause. "You reminded me that there's a different measurement. I'm trying to use it more." He looked at the ceiling of his garage. "You already use it," he said. "You used it when you came back the morning after the rain. Most people wouldn't have come back. I had to. No. You could have sent a lawyer, a check, an email from an assistant. That would have been the corporate response." He paused. "You came back yourself. That was a choice." She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had the texture of something she didn't say often. "I came back because I couldn't stop thinking about you under that truck," she said. Not romantically. Just the image of you sliding back under the truck after everything that had happened. Like it was the most natural thing in the world to go back to work. "It was the most natural thing," he said. "I know. That's what I couldn't stop thinking about." They did not get married quickly. That was not how either of them was built. What they did was accumulate time together, real time, not curated time. Dinners at the kitchen table in Asher's small house, the overhead light too bright, Caleb demonstrating his evolving theories about bridge design and municipal infrastructure, Helena engaging with complete seriousness, and occasionally being corrected by a 10-year-old who had by that point read significantly more about structural engineering than she had. They did weekends at the garage, Helena learning the names of tools with the methodical attention she brought to everything new. She was not naturally mechanical. She understood systems and principles readily, but the physical intuition took longer, and she was not someone who accepted her own slow progress gracefully, which was one of the more human things about her, and which Asher pointed out with enough gentleness that she only threw a shop rag at him once. They did hard evenings, too. The nights when Asher went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with Helena and everything to do with the particular weight of a Tuesday in November that was the anniversary of something. And she'd learned not to fill those silences, not to pull him back, but just to be present in the room, which was what he needed, and which, he told her once, was harder to offer than most people realized. She had her own hard evenings, the specific exhaustion of running a large institution through a period of genuine reform. The resistance of people within the company who understood that the changes Helena was making would cost them comfort. The occasional morning when she looked at the calendar and felt the accumulated weight of everything on it and thought, I am so tired. He learned to recognize that tiredness and to not offer solutions, because her tiredness didn't need solutions. It needed someone to sit across from her with a cup of bad coffee. He had not significantly upgraded the coffee maker and say, I know, and mean it. Caleb, for his part, moved through all of this with the adaptable pragmatism of a kid who'd spent his entire conscious life in a world defined by adjustment. He didn't perform acceptance of Helena. He didn't have a dramatic moment of deciding she was family. He just gradually, without announcement, started including her in the way he included things that were real. He texted her engineering questions when he found them. He told her when his school project went well before he told most people. He referred to her in conversation at school, apparently as Helena, my dad's person, which a teacher relayed to Asher with the particular warmth of someone who found it charming, and which Asher relayed to Helena, who was quiet for a moment and then said, your dad's person. I like that. He has a gift for accuracy, Asher said. He gets it from somewhere, she said, the same thing she'd said in the garage months ago, and he remembered she'd said it and understood that she meant the same thing she'd meant then. They were married 2 years after the rainstorm. Small ceremony, the word small being relative, since Helena's definition of small was still larger than Asher's default, and they'd negotiated it down from her initial instinct and up from his, arriving somewhere in the actual middle. Caleb stood beside Asher. He'd asked to, with the straightforward directness he brought to everything important, sitting at the kitchen table one evening and saying, I want to stand next to you. If that's okay. It's okay, Asher said. Okay, Caleb said, and went back to his homework. Sandra attended. Priya attended. Dominic attended with his wife and spent most of the reception talking to Ruth, who'd also been invited because Asher had decided that if you were going to mark a significant occasion, it should be with people who were actually in your life, rather than people who were impressive to have in a room. Ruth's van had finally, approximately 3 months before, been declared beyond economical repair, and she'd bought a newer one, and she'd brought Asher a bottle of whiskey and a card that said, for everything else. He'd kept the card. The ceremony was outside, late afternoon in October, the sky the specific blue of autumn that has a cold edge to it, and Helena walked across the grass in a dress that was not white she'd told him early on. She had no interest in the theatrical aspects of the thing, only the actual thing, and her hair was down, and she looked like herself, which was the only version of her that mattered. She reached him and Caleb, and she looked at them both for a moment before she said anything, and whatever was in her face in that moment was between her and them, and not for the assembled witnesses. Then she said quietly, so that mostly just Asher could hear, You ready? I've been ready, he said. You took a while. She laughed, the real one, and Caleb said Dad with the tone of a child who has decided this is embarrassing. And Asher looked at his son and felt the full weight of everything they'd moved through together and the specific lightness of where they'd arrived, and thought, yes, this is it. This is the thing. The garage stayed. This was not negotiable and had never been discussed as negotiable. Helena had a house, a significant one, in the better part of the city, large in ways that spoke to years of building a life optimized for success rather than warmth. They spent time there. It was closer to Carrington Motors, and there were evenings when she needed to be reachable and operational, and the distance mattered. But they kept the garage and the small house attached to it, and Asher worked there on weekends and some evenings, and Caleb grew into a teenager who did homework at the workbench when the mood struck him. And the neighborhood knew them and waved when they passed, and the coffee maker was never upgraded, and the water stain on the ceiling was eventually patched, and the back door that leaked during rain was eventually fixed. And small ordinary repairs accumulated the way small ordinary repairs do in a life that is being lived rather than staged. The Renewal Engineering Center grew. By the 3rd year, it had trained and placed over 200 people, had 3 satellite locations, had a partnership with 4 industry employers that Asher had negotiated himself, sitting across from people who were accustomed to Helena's composure and therefore not quite prepared for Asher's particular combination of technical precision and absolute refusal to accept vague commitments. They got better terms than they'd expected. He didn't tell Helena this, but she figured it out from the contracts. "You're a good negotiator," she said. "I know what I want," he said. "Most people go in not knowing what they actually want. That's where the negotiation goes wrong." "Is that how it worked with me?" He looked at her. "I knew what I wanted," he said. "I wasn't sure I should have it. What changed your mind?" He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about things that deserved seriousness. "Caleb," he said finally, not because he approved or disapproved. "Because I watched him with you, just being with you, not trying to figure out if you were safe, just being easy in your presence. And I thought, he knows something I'm trying to reason my way around. Kids don't overthink the things that are true." She looked at him for a long moment. "I was so lonely," she said. "It came out plainly, the way true things come out when you've stopped managing them. For so long. And the strange part is I didn't know how lonely I was until I wasn't anymore." "You don't notice a sound until it stops. I know," he said. "Same thing." She leaned against him, just that, just her shoulder against his, in the kitchen of the small house with the too bright light, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there in the ordinary specific reality of two people who found each other the wrong way, and at the wrong time, and under impossible circumstances, and held on anyway. 5 years after the wedding, another rainstorm came through Millhaven. The kind that arrived fast, the way storms did on the harbor's edge, without much warning, turning the streets outside the warehouse district into small brown rivers in the space of 20 minutes. Caleb was 15 now, and he was at the workbench in the garage, not doing homework this time, but working through a design problem. He'd set himself a scaled model of a modified cable stay configuration for the northern bridge span, the one he'd identified as inefficient at age 9, and apparently never entirely let go of. He'd been working on it for 3 weeks, and the model was beginning to look like something that corresponded to his intentions, which was the moment in any engineering project where the relationship between the idea and the reality starts to stop being adversarial. Helena was sitting on the stool near the workbench, watching him work, occasionally asking a question when the silence needed something in it. She'd learned a great deal about engineering in 5 years of living adjacent to it, not enough to do it, but enough to ask the questions that made Caleb think harder, which was a different skill and arguably more useful in the long run. Asher was under a car. A newer customer, a young woman, mid-20s, who'd moved into the neighborhood 2 months ago and had shown up at the garage with the slightly apologetic energy of someone who doesn't know what's wrong and suspects they should. He'd found the problem, fixed it, was doing the final check. He slid out. Helena was looking at the rain on the bay entrance, the pale rectangle of wet street beyond the open door. The rain coming in sheets, the same as it had 5 years ago when she'd first run through it. He watched her face while she looked at it. She wasn't a woman whose face gave away everything years of necessary opacity had built that in, but he knew her face, and what he saw in it was the specific quality of someone sitting with a particular memory, and finding that the memory has changed its weight over time. She felt him looking at her. She turned. "Do you remember," she said, "what you thought when I left? That first night. I thought you wouldn't come back," he said. "You told me I was wrong, you were." A pause. "What would have happened if I hadn't?" He considered it. Not theoretically, but actually trying to inhabit the alternative version of the last 5 years. The garage, and Caleb, and the mortgage almost caught up, and Victor Langston still in his investor position, and the R7 program moving forward with the flaw in the thermal coupling no one had found yet, and the backup server sitting in a decommissioned corner of Carrington Motors' IT infrastructure, with the unmissed truth of what had happened preserved in it, patient and inaccessible. The investigation would have happened eventually, he said. Priya is thorough. She'd have found the inconsistencies. Maybe, Helena said, the prototype would have been completed. Probably. Victor would have been caught eventually. Things like that usually surface. Usually, she said. And then but, he said, and he didn't finish it because she knew the finish. But Caleb would have grown up without this, without Helena at the workbench asking questions, without the book on structural engineering left on a kitchen counter, without someone who looked at his ideas as if they might actually work, because she understood from long experience that some things that seem too ambitious are actually just ambitious enough. But Asher would have kept the anger packed in the way he'd packed it carefully, at the cost of the energy required to keep it contained, gradually exhausting the space that might have gone toward something else. But he would have been fine. He wanted to say that, and it was true. He would have been fine. He was a person who survived things, and he would have kept surviving. But fine and this were not the same thing. "I'm glad you came in," he said. She looked at him with the expression he'd come to recognize as her most unguarded one, the one that existed before the competence, and after the composure, the one that was just Helena, 55 years old, who had spent a long time being impressive and had found, late, that being known was more valuable. "I was terrified," she said, "coming in here that night. Not of the rain, of asking a stranger for something." "You were good at it," he said. "I was desperate," she said. "Which is different." She paused. Though maybe desperation is just wanting something badly enough to stop being careful about it. He thought about that. He thought it was probably accurate, and probably applied to more than that one night. Caleb looked up from his model. He'd been listening, he usually was, with the same unobtrusive thoroughness he brought to everything. "The cable configuration is working," he said, to no one in particular. "I think it's working." Asher went over and looked at the model. He studied it the way he studied all engineering completely, from first principles, not assuming the conclusion before he saw the evidence. "It was working." "Yes," he said. "It is." Caleb sat back and looked at it with the specific satisfaction of someone who has been at a problem long enough that seeing it resolve is almost surreal. "I want to show the actual bridge people eventually. When it's further along." "The actual bridge people," Asher repeated. "The city engineers. Whoever manages the infrastructure." Caleb looked at Helena. "Do you know any of them?" Helena's mouth pulled at the corner. "I might know someone who knows someone." "Good," Caleb said, with the simplicity of a person who has identified a resource and is now filing it for later use, and went back to his model. Asher looked at Helena, looking at his son. Her face was doing the thing it did, the quiet, unperformed thing, the expression that wasn't for anyone except her own interior. That meant she was feeling something she hadn't arranged in advance. He thought about what she'd said once, about loneliness being a sound you don't notice until it stops. He thought about his own version of that, the years in the garage, the specific quality of a life that is functional and sufficient, but hollow in a way you stop noticing because noticing it doesn't help. The sound of Caleb's footsteps on the floor above him, which kept the worst of the silence at bay, but couldn't fill the rest. He thought about what Caleb had said about her smile, like she'd forgotten it was something she could do. They'd both forgotten things, and they'd reminded each other, and that was the whole story, really. That was the core of it, stripped of everything else. You can survive a very long time on the minimum of what you need. You can build a whole life around surviving, and it will be a real life your son will be fed, and your work will be honest, and you will be, by most measures, okay. And then something happens, a rainstorm, a stranger, a desperate 5 minutes in the wrong place at the right time, and you remember that surviving was never the point. The point was always this: another person across the table, a child turning a page, work that matters, a hand turning over in yours. The point was always being alive enough to know the difference. The rain fell on the bay entrance, and the light inside the garage was warm and yellow and slightly too industrial to be pretty. And Caleb's model sat on the workbench, looking like the beginning of something real, and Asher stood in the middle of his garage, still his, always his, and felt the full, ordinary, extraordinary weight of where 5 minutes had brought them. Helena came to stand beside him. She didn't say anything. She looked at the rain, and then at Caleb, and then at him, and she put her hand in his, the way you put your hand in someone's when you're not proving anything, just because it's where it belongs. They closed the garage together when the rain passed, and walked home through the clean, wet air of a Millhaven evening, the three of them. Caleb talking about the bridge and Helena asking questions, and Asher listening to both of them, with the specific piece of a man who has arrived somewhere he didn't plan for and found it more than enough. 5 minutes of pretending had given them a lifetime that was finally, completely, undeniably real. And the lifetime, like all real things, was not perfect, it was better than perfect. It was theirs.